Hi guys, my name is Trey Ford. I'm here just to do a brief introduction. This talk is not the Ollie B talk. This is a talk by Alex Hutton and Allison Miller, ushering in the post-GRC world applied threat modeling. Alex Hutton is the principal research and intelligence. He's the principal researcher and part of the intelligence team, risk modeling over at Verizon Business. He's one of the authors of the Data Breach Incident Response Report, which, by the way, was released today. He's one of the custodians of the Verus framework. He blogs at New School and the Verizon Security blog. Allison Miller is a group manager for risk and fraud at PayPal. She works with network graphing and identity data to detect fraud patterns. Previously, she served as director of product risk at Visa International, specialized in e-commerce, prepaid, and cross-border remittance solutions, as well as various gigs and other InfoSec ops. They're both founding members of the Society of Information Risk Analysts. So, take it away, guys.
Can you hear me? Is this on? All right, great. Well, thanks for coming. As Trey said, my name's Alex. I'll be talking for the first part, and then Allison's going to take over and teach us a bunch of stuff. And then we'll wrap it up with some practical application and a couple of examples. There are a lot of people who talk these days about what is risk management, what is information security. And if you listen to a lot of them, they'll offer to you that information security and what we see, it's a lot of pseudoscience. And I actually like to think that we're more of what Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher, said called a proto-science. And if you look at how he defines a proto-science, I think it'll speak to a lot of similarities. If you've ever tried to create metrics, if you've ever tried to get data, if you've ever tried to manage by evidence, right? That's exactly what we start to see. So if we are going to study risk management, if we are going to study information security, what do we need to study? This is actually deceptively simple in my mind. Jack Jones, who I worked with for a while, he used to be a security officer at Nationwide, he always defined it as 4 landscapes. You have a threat landscape, and you need information and understanding about the change in information for the threat landscape. You have a controls landscape, you have an asset landscape, and you have an impact landscape. As he continued to teach me about these things, one of the things that I noticed is that actually a Venn diagram better represents actually what we want to study. And the reason for that is if you think about where the circles overlap, we actually have synthesis of information. So one of the things that I've been noticing, and you guys who are actually in enterprise risk management programs talk about this, and let me know how you feel. But it's a disconnect between GRC, what the risk analyst actually is doing, and operational security. And recently I ran a quick poll. It was just a bunch of people on Twitter, a bunch of people on the Security Metrics mailing list, a bunch of folks who read the New School of Information Security blog and so forth. And it's completely unscientific. I just wanted to see what I got back. But it did show that there was it really asked, okay, so how often does your GRC analyst actually interact with operational security? And for the most part, I got back not at all, never. It just doesn't happen. And so when I've thought about GRC, I actually see it as a construct that's been fabricated over the past few years, and I really find some real problems with this as a construct. And I'm going to talk about them backwards. And the first one I want to talk about is compliance. Okay? I see any compliance standard that's built as a model. Why? If you think about PCI DSS, you think about a standard like ISO 27001, all this is a bunch of people in a group, in a room saying, well, we think this is how you should defend a network. These are the things that we think you should be doing in order to resist attackers. If that's so, and Allison disagrees with me, and that's okay, if that's so, I offer to you that that's actually a model. And if it is a model, then what E.T. James said in his book it basically is that models are really hypotheses, and they're subject to scientific method, and they should be disproven. They should be falsified. So to me, compliance without metrics, that's just a bunch of guys in the room saying, do this. But if you start adding models and metrics to compliance things, now you can actually say, here's a standard. And based on what we've collected around incidents, what we've collected around successes for this standard, well, this standard's bogus, or this piece of the standard's bogus, or this standard needs to be, we need to audit on this standard in total. So what about risk? And this is where I really have a problem with a lot of GRC suites and constructs. Risk, as I've seen it, basically is what Andrew Jaquith calls a hamster wheel of pain. It is find issue, right? Figure out how bad the issue is, fix the issue, and then hope the next time you do some discovery method, you don't see the issue ever again, right? And the problem I have with this approach is severalfold. First, anybody who's done an actual enterprise risk assessment and you get back like 500 pages of information, how are you supposed to synthesize that? How do you check? And this is exactly like a vulnerability assessment, right? Okay, so great, I've got 500 mediums. What do I do with that? Right? How do I know? In risk, it's even worse. I've got a low likelihood and a high impact, or medium likelihood and a medium impact, right? And that's just qualitative models. When we get into quantitative models, half the models, if you look out there, are using ordinal scales. And then they're using multiplication on ordinal scales. And if anybody here knows anything about math, multiplying ordinal scales kind of breaks the way the universe works. You can't do it. So that's kind of the first problem that I find. The second problem is this. When you're actually out there collecting risk issues, this particular threat specifically might attack this particular asset in this particular way, and you're collecting bunches of these, you're really making point predictions. And if anybody has ever studied complex adaptive systems, one of the tenets, and that's difficult because it's a new science and there are plenty of other definitions and so forth out there, but one of the basic tenets of it is that point possibilities are extremely difficult, if not impossible. If the only thing you can do is identify patterns within those. In other words, those who are the founders of that particular field would look at what we're doing in information security and figure, are you guys nuts? Really? I like this. This is something else Jack came up with, and it's a new definition for risk management. If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, especially if you think about it from a CISO standpoint. Really, it's taking exposure to risk, and it's taking your capability to manage risk, what you do with your resources that the data owners have given you, and you're matching that to the tolerance of the data owners. And it should be noted that as security professionals, a lot of the times, we think that means lower risk, lower risk, lower risk, lower risk. Well, what about like DSW, who just went, yeah, okay, great, we're out of PCI compliance, have a nice time, we're going to take the fines, right? That was actually the data owners saying, what they're telling me to do, that does not match my tolerance for risk. So I'm not going to be bothered with it right now because it's expensive for me economically. Taking that definition into consideration, let's talk about governance. Governance, in a sense, can be defined as, I've heard it defined as that which we're supposed to do, right? So I have a problem with that in that if you're in management theory, and governance really is an expression of how you should manage a business, right? If you're in management, business management theory, this is W. Edwards Deming, who for those of you who don't recognize the face, and for those of you who don't know, he basically changed the world with quality management. One of the reasons why the Japanese automobile makers overtook the US and so forth, right? Because he went and basically studied what was going on in production lines and said, okay, if you want quality, if you want the right production, if you want optimized production, you're going to measure. And you're going to measure and you're going to apply the results back, right? So basically that's where Demings gave us this quote. When you talk about governance, how I interpret that is governance, again, without metrics, without models, is basically superstition. It's a bunch of guys getting in a room saying, well, you know, this feels like how we should govern a security program. Right? Governance, however, with metrics and models, my assertion is a capability to manage risk. And let me explain that this way. Here's Dirty Harry. Everybody kind of know, seen Dirty Harry movie? One of my favorites, right? So here's Dirty Harry, and you're staring down that barrel. Now let's say Dirty Harry represents a couple things. First off, does he follow policies and procedures? No. Is he effective? Yeah. And I realize I'm pointing to television and movies and these, but I think the logic is decent here. Here's Barney Fife, right? Was he a stickler for policies and procedures? If you ever watched, yes. Was he very effective? Not without Andy Griffith behind him. That was the whole freaking crux of the comedy relationship. And these guys, if you gave these guys a procedure to follow, like baking a cake, the next thing you know, you've got a rubber boot and nitrous oxide in the cake. It's the point being, governance, unless you're managing how you're doing, well, it's basically superstition, and you don't know if you're doing a good job or not. Now, think about it this way. If he's your IDS guy, if he's an operational security analyst, do you have more or less risk with him at the helm? Anyone? Less? Anybody want to say less? Anybody want to say more risk? I got Adam, and I knew that. All right. Now, comparatively, if we replace him, he takes off and leaves because he can't take hanging with the chief security officer anymore, and we replace him with Don Knotts. Now, compared to Dirty Harry, do we have more or less risk? What if we decide, we're overpaying Don, we're going to get rid of him, and we're going to hire these three guys? Do we have more or less risk? The point is that your capabilities impact your risk. Governance with metrics and models is therefore simply a statement of your capability to manage risk and is a component of risk management. Back to that earlier definition, right? You add to that something that I read on the flight out, which was a study from Carnegie Mellon. It's not in the paper that you'll find on the website, but if you ping me on Twitter or email me or go to a blog, I can point it to you. But it's a Carnegie Mellon study where they actually surveyed the board of directors for Fortune 1000 companies. Anybody want to guess what percentage of those Fortune 1000 companies' board of directors was really interested in information security and IT governance? Anybody want to guess? Go ahead. 8%? It was 5? It was 0. It was 0. In contrast, 56% of them were really interested in the risk management programs, the operational risk management programs, under which IT would fall under. So as I look at GRC, and I hope that I've made a convincing argument here, we can't have any more disconnect. Operations actually influences what we do. So with that said, I do want to turn it over to Allison.
Okay, so I might help if I give you a little bit of background on what it is that I do. I actually work in risk and fraud, and so for me, risk management is not very theoretical at all. It's very real in the sense that when we make mistakes, we find out because we lose money. And when it comes to management, just in general, one of the things they dislike is losing money, and it's something they're very attuned to. So that could explain why many executives are quite interested in risk management with the actual emphasis on management. One of the points that Alex and I disagree on is whether compliance programs actually provide a model. I think that they don't, actually, because models are things that I use to understand how my system is supposed to work. And so compliance programs compliance seems like it's a good idea to do, as opposed to necessarily things that are going to help me make my system more predictable and be able to systematically lower risk. So one of the things that is how we can use models, in fact, to close the gap between assessment, which is what I feel like a lot of governance and are you going to help me here? Hello? Okay, all right, cool. Okay, closing the gap between assessment and defense. So, what does that mean? There's three major places where I see risk and threat modeling as being useful to a risk management program. Design, management, and operations. And what I mean here when I say design is not just design of the control system, but the design of the system itself. embedding risk management into the design of your system itself, and then management here meaning the processes that we undertake in order to keep the system predictable, and finally operations. In the operations section, I'm talking a little bit more about really technical modeling, like statistical modeling efforts that you would actually employ in running your system. So when we think about design, if you are of the nature that you think security should be built in as opposed to bolted on, I think that you would find hope in this quote, Len Fisher, who's has written some books on game theory, suggesting that evolution favors strategies that minimize the risk of loss as opposed to maximize the chance of gain. And I think that, you know, human behavior is such that folks are actually risk averse. Most people don't really have a high tolerance for risk. Successful systems are going to be the ones that are able to defend and evolve against unnecessary risks. And this is one of the reasons why system models are actually different from maps. I think when we do assessments, whether for compliance purposes or for enterprise risk management purposes, essentially what we are doing is we are cataloging or inventorying components, which allows us to kind of design maps of our system. We know where things are, and we can count the things that are wrong with them or the things that are out of compliance, for example. But models actually include dynamics. The influences that drive how a system actually behaves, not just what is in the system. The other thing that is quite interesting about system models is that you have to have an understanding of your system boundaries. A system model, essentially, I could whiteboard it, I suppose, but if you just want to imagine, a system model could just be a circle with input, something goes on, and output. And the better the model, the better your ability to predict based on a certain input and your understanding of your dynamics what the output is going to be. So that sounded like a lot of fun. Let's bring that back to something a little more real. You're a system owner, you own a system, perhaps it's a network, perhaps it's a website, perhaps it's a whole company. In security, and a lot of the compliance and GRC programs that are out there put an emphasis on defining a perimeter, hardening it, and then trying to maintain within the system some level of security as defined by best practices or some kind of standard. However, that's not really the reality of how our systems work, right? No system is, what's the word? Whatever, wholly unto itself. No man is an island, and no system is either. Our systems don't exist just for their own purposes. They exist because we have users to serve or partners that we work with. And there's a lot of moving parts in our system, and a lot of things coming from the outside and connecting to the inside. It's how things work. In payments, how this works, or at least in my, we actually have users who can log into our system. When I think about that for a moment, I work for PayPal. Where are PayPal's system boundaries? Are our system boundaries at our firewalls, or are they at our users' client systems? So if you acknowledge that your risk is interconnected with your customers or your users or your partners' risk, then you have to acknowledge the boundary of your system is a lot broader than what you necessarily have control over in your own day-to-day operations. Why is it useful to acknowledge this? It's useful to acknowledge this because when you're dealing with attacks or risks or threats or whatever you want to call them, those things that are coming from the outside in, or there could be an insider threat as well, but let's just say threat agents are external to the appropriate processing of your system. Where are those threats going to manifest? Are they going to manifest on your systems, or do you also need to take into consideration, in order to estimate what's really going to happen in your system, are you going to have to understand the vulnerability or the system dynamics of your users as well? And that's kind of a rhetorical question, because I think we all acknowledge that when we have users, client security can be just as important as, say, having a hardened firewall in place. All right, so everybody likes to talk about fraud. I want to give a really high-level example of a threat model, something that I find a little bit useful, something that sort of summarizes some of the concepts I'm talking about around design. Now, I have here an example of essentially a genericized version of fraud. In this case, it's buyer fraud. And in trying to diagram this out, I initially started with threat tree diagram. Are any of you familiar with Schneier's paper on this? He published it in like 99. Thank you very much. So I really liked the paper, and what I was wondering what we could do with threat trees if they were iterative. And what I kind of mean there is how can you map out an entire system using a threat tree? And I had a really hard time doing that because what I found was the actual mechanisms by which the threats manifested clustered. And so what I mean here is in trying to sort of diagnose or from a high level expose what the actual threat model is for fraud, everything was clustering in these three categories. There was some kind of technical exploit and then some kind of misuse of credentials, but ultimately then funds come out of the system. And so when you sort of cluster these, you can kind of cut and paste which type of attack or exactly what it is that the fraudster does. But let's walk through it. Okay, someone sends out a phishing email. The phishing mail has an obfuscated link. Maybe it's using a URL shortener, or maybe it's actually using like the special character code set, whatever, so that you can't actually see that it's redirecting you. And then you are redirected someplace where either you're asked for your credentials and you give them up, or you get a drive-by malware and your credentials are sucked right off of your computer, in which case now an evil actor has your credentials. And so, of course, when we kind of look at the market for credential theft, we find that it's not always the person who has grabbed the credentials that actually uses them. Reselling that happens within that industry, which is kind of an interesting economic thing to look at on its own. But eventually then, someone has to be the actor, the fraudster. And so even though it was a technical exploit that started off this chain, then what ends up happening is your basic, boring, run-of-the-mill financial fraud. Someone's going to use a stolen credit card, or they're going to use a stolen bank account, or they're going to ATO some kind of account. They're going to impersonate someone. They're going to commit fraud, and some kind of transaction happens. But that's not all necessarily, because eventually the person who commits the fraud is going to want money out of the system. They want cash. They want something that they can convert into cash. So if you're interested, there's a couple different ways to do that. You can buy goods that are easily resold. You can, like digital goods or consumer electronics, or you can try and figure out how to bounce funds around across different systems in order to extract cash to yourself. So any questions about this? Oftentimes people questions about fraud. Yes? What's ATO? Sorry, account takeover is what that stands for. So I think, yeah, okay. Any other questions? But you see how the technical attack, it could be any kind of thing. You could have phishing, or you could have malware, or you could have, a joke program. It doesn't have to be someone gives something up, or that someone extrapolates something based on pulling information from social networks. There's all different kinds of ways you can get through the chain, but ultimately the output is money comes out. And that's the really interesting part for us, because for folks who are in fraud, because of course that's where it becomes really real for us. The other thing to note here is up there in the exploit vulnerability section, those aren't things that happen on our system that we can control, but the threats that we face from this type of activity manifest on our system in a really real and direct way, and it behooves us to understand how the whole chain works when we are designing our controls. For us at PayPal, for example, not only do we have extensive controls on the system, but we also have outbound efforts. Because if you want to attack a threat, then you're economical and opportunistic in how you do that. And so if we can help, for example, get rid of phishing sites, then that helps reduce our propensity to see this kind of behavior. All right. So you've designed a system, you designed the controls. That means you have an idea of how the system is supposed to behave. Well, then what do? You figure out where you were wrong and you iterate. That's where management comes in. So Douglas Hubbard, who's the author of The Failure of Risk Management, pretty popular book among us academic risk wonks lately, has a great quote, which is, risk management that reacts to yesterday's news is not risk management at all. True, but if you're not aware of your history, you're kind of doomed to repeat it. Did you guys catch that? Do I have to repeat that? Probably not. Oh. That would be even easier. Switching mics. Okay. But the problem with this idea that reacting to old news is bad, it doesn't work. You have to be able to learn, and that's where it's really important to have feedback loops in your system that you can kind of instrument so that you understand what your performance is. Because essentially what management is having an estimated performance and then managing the operations of your system to that performance. And when something is not working, if something is behaving in a way that is not what you need to meet your objectives, you go in and you change it, which is why design and management are sort of iterative processes here. And let me move on quickly to operations, because I know that we're going to talk a little bit more about metrics later. The way that technically risk management dives into operations usually has to do with the automation of decisions. So an example of a system model that is driven into operations I want to give is sort of active traffic flow analysis. Basically the way the timings of lights on city streets are put into place. There are a lot of different heavy-duty statistical quants who work on these problems trying to optimize traffic flow through streets, just as an example. So you can imagine that that gets pretty complicated. And just sort of a nice little quote from one of my favorite physicists, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. Absolutely, that is true. And however, using computers can really help you do that. And the way that we use quantitative models that are driven into operations is basically to assist in making system decisions. And this is when we actually come back to the concept of feedback loops. In management, we're interested in feedback loops because feedback loops give us an understanding of metrics, how we're performing. In these quantitative models, the reason why we're interested in feedback loops is because at some point we're going to have to go back and evaluate whether we made a good decision or a bad decision. Statistics allow us to optimize decisions, but in order to optimize, you have to know when you are right or wrong. So in the example of fraud, for example, we need to know if we declined a transaction, was it fraud or wasn't it? If we approved a transaction, was it fraud or wasn't it? And when you collect the evidence, then you can go back and you can improve your models. So essentially what we find in financial fraud is that patterns that can be defined, and they can be defined in a number of different ways. You can use heuristics, statistics, machine logic, but ultimately you're going to have data that gives you some kind of evidence that something good or bad happened. And if you can define that pattern, then you can actually detect it using these different techniques. And that is one of the reasons why we consume so much data. So if you are embedding models within your operations, you're going to be a data-hungry organization. That's great, because the output of your performance then is pretty easily quantified, which you can explain to management. It usually makes them very, very happy. Now, in our system, we have a lot of internal data that we can use, and most folks who manage systems end up creating tons and tons and tons of data. If you're instrumenting things at interesting points, for example, in fraud, where the money leaves the system, or where financial instruments are attached to an account, or where transactions happen between people, you end up creating tons and tons of data that you can use to analyze later. However, And however, internal data is not the only source of data that you can use if you're trying to optimize your decisions, if you're trying to optimize your design, the way you manage your systems, or how you operate them. Internal data is the most useful because it's the most telling about how your system is operating, but you can, of course, go externally and get information. Have any of you tried to go externally to get information to help you improve your decisions or your design of your systems internally? Yes-ish. Folks have. So the interesting thing about that is it's very useful to help you understand your performance in the context of others, for example, benchmarking. However, you can also incorporate them more directly into things like operations. You just have to convert the data into something that sort of aligns with your existing data set. And that's why we have so many statisticians in the world, and why data sharing programs are really complicated and difficult to kind of set up in ways that meet all the needs of the stakeholders. However, there's hope, which we're getting to in a moment. So I think this quote is kind of important for information security folks. There's a story about some philosophers or statisticians who were told to go look for some keys that had been lost in a parking lot. And someone walking by noticed that this guy was walking around in circles under a lamppost. It was really dark out, but he was really looking for that keys, but he was just going around and around. And someone said, "Why are you only looking in this one spot?" And he's like, "Oh, well, this is the only place where I can see the ground." And so when we communicate as security or risk professionals back up to management, management needs to have data that, or needs to have data expressed in ways that are quantifiable and feel really real to them. And so I think it's useful for us to consider new models and new approaches simply because the communication gap between assessment and defense there's a communication gap as well as a sort of an operational gap between assessment and defense. And the better we are able to communicate and use numbers and use the language of business, the more likely we are to be successful in the risk management programs that we put into place. So if you harvest your internal systems and use the data that you have there from all the feedback loops, that is one place to get data, but where else can you get data? Alex Hutton, do you have any ideas?
All right, so while I'm transitioning here, I just want to get a couple of concepts of what Allison said. I want to put them in the back of your mind for a second. First is patterns, right? I talked about how in terms of risk modeling, and if we are a complex system, you can only look and discern for patterns, which is a lot of what she was talking about. And so hold that one in the back of your mind. What I want to ask you now, though, is, all right, so I've put forth, that, governance is really just risk management, that governance is fair, what we think of as governance now in information security is fairly fabricated, probably by vendors. The second thing being our risk modeling is really terrible, at times impossible, it's completely uninformative, even when we do a good job in predicting and predictive analytics. What is the role of risk modeling in the future? We've given you, Allison started to give us a little bit of insight into that. It's actually talking about the systems. So, I work for Verizon in the Risk Intelligence Group. We did release our data breach report today. This is something we did with the Secret Service. We now have 900 incidents that are represented in this report. It's really a fantastic piece of data and a fantastic work. And we're going to actually take the fact that we're sharing this, keep it open, and we're going to do something with it. One of the things that we had to do in terms of working with the Secret Service, and in fact working with our own people internally, is give them a framework. Take an incident narrative. First the bad guy did this, then that, then the other thing. Sort of like what Allison was showing you in her slide with the threat actions back to exfiltration and monetization. And we had to actually turn those into metrics. And what we created was a framework for this. It's called Veris, and it's open. It's as close to that I could get Verizon's legal team to give me a Creative Commons non-commercial share-alike attribute license. And basically, it's designed to create metrics out of these incident narratives. It has several parts. First, it's got a demographic part, which is simply, iPad gone wild, hold on a sec. All right, which is simply industry. That's very informative when you start collecting information. It's the size of the company. That gives us all sorts of indicators. The geographic location and the size of the security department. We use size of the security department because that kind of gives us a comparison between size of the organization, size of the security department in terms of full-time employees, and what kind of resources they're throwing against the information security problems and risk management problems that they have. There's an incident classification piece. We see an incident in terms of that narrative, the guy did this, then he did that, then he did the other thing, as a series of objects. They're events in time. Each object has 4 sets of metadata. It has an action, or an agent, an asset, an action, and an attribute. We use Don Parker's hexad, if you're familiar with that, in the attribute bits. We put these events together, and suddenly we have a modeled story of what the incident consisted of. We also do discovery and mitigation. That gives us informative data about the ability to detect and respond for the organization, and second level prevent. We all know prevent, detect, and respond is fractal, right? And an impact modeling section, classification schema. You take all that information together, and suddenly you have this set of Verus information that you can use. We have 900 of these sets of Verus information now. So we can start comparing each failure evidence together. And we can see, well, hey, B there was extremely similar to E. We can look for patterns that are that similar. We can even look for patterns that match specific demographic pieces and specific small threat pieces. So what does it mean to be post-GRC in the context of Verus? What we're looking at is evidence. It's evidence of what went wrong. If anybody familiar with the term evidence-based medicine? Here? I got one, I got two. All right, so evidence-based medicine, for those of you who don't know, is basically saying, okay, well, we're going to have scientific studies on what works and what doesn't, and what we are going to prescribe as a doctor is what works best. Evidence-based risk management would therefore be a CISO saying, hey, I'm going to prescribe what works best, or I'm not going to do those things that make me suck. These are expressed basically by models that we talked about. I want to give you a real-world example, borrow Allison's system, and if you take my assertion that what we're dealing with is actually the entanglement of multiple complex systems, you've got problems. You've got a lot of data that you need to process. You've got a lot of things that you have to do. Now what's interesting is we've been sitting here and we've been talking about models, we've been talking about statistics, we've made allusions to philosophers and so forth. Very highly academic. You'll forgive us for that. But I want you to know that this is not an academic pursuit. First off, I've been preaching the concept of data warehousing and business intelligence for use in security for several years now. Gartner finally issued a report and said, hey, this is going to be a big trend over the next 5 years. To that extent, I don't know of a lot of people doing it, but the ones I do know involve a large financial institution who has 50 terabytes of data from 60 different data sources. He's actually preventing Zeus infections and fraudulent ACH transfers by doing exactly what we're trying to tell you about here today. He's throwing away risk modeling as I'm going to go look at my enterprise, I'm going to do a vulnerability assessment, I'm going to try and figure out how bad all these things are. He's instead having his risk analysts integrate with operations and actually spawn processes that say, oop, this is not an ACH transfer that's going through. So he actually is actually, that specific organization is actually going to spool up to 110 different data sources and over 100 terabytes of information and some sort of Hadoop installation that I really need to learn about. And basically, it's just this information. Back to that deceptively simple Venn diagram that I gave you in the synthesis of that information. So if we're talking about the future, if we're going to throw off GRC and say, you know what, this doesn't make any sense at all. You talk about the future. This is what the future of risk analytics is. It's integration with operational security and the actual defense, not in the actual answering to IT audits and external auditors. So that leaves one problem, and that problem is this. The data owners themselves, the people that we report to, they really like these stoplights. They really like these individual point statements that we're asserting we can't really do, and so forth. They like the reporting. And so one of the things that I'm trying to wrap my mind around is, how do we report this? And what I wanted to actually talk about is drawing a lesson from something that might be familiar to some of you. This is Jose Cardinal. This is his 1978 Phillies card. It's one of my favorite cards for obvious reasons. But if you look on the back, and this is a Yogi Berra card, what they're actually giving you is a dashboard, right? You don't think of the back of a baseball card as a dashboard, but it is. And here you have an old Yogi Berra card, and you have basic information that tells you what kind of baseball player Yogi Berra is, right? As we got a little more sophisticated now, you see that there are many more statistics. And so you can look at games and at-bats, and you can tell if he's a full-time player. You can compare that in terms of games and say, okay, now he's not only a full-time player, but over the course of his history, and you know, we don't have history on Yogi there, right? He plays a bunch. He's always been a starter, and he does get hurt often, and he has some level of power, he has some level of strikeouts, he has some level of all of these things. And I'm sorry that this came out blurry a bit, but when you talk about Barry Bonds, now we have a very sophisticated history, a very sophisticated set of attributions about what kind of baseball player he was. And the red bits there, if you can just barely pick those out, that's where he led the league. So now you have this new thing called comparative analytics. Verizon's got 900 good, confident set of analytics for folks to compare against that we have released and will continue to work on in releasing. And in a framework that you can take and apply at home, absolutely free. There's a wiki, go use it, knock yourself out, we don't care, right? So if we have the ability to try and say, here's a notion of what kind of good baseball player Barry Bonds may or may not be, how can we do that for these? And my assertion is this. Deconstruct it. I borrowed the concept of balanced scorecard. I was inspired again by Andrew J. Queef and his book on security metrics. But I don't think the balanced scorecard that we should be applying, at least initially to understand whether or not we're doing a great job at managing risk and defending against threats, really is what you find in a regular balanced scorecard. I think what we simply do is deconstruct that Venn diagram and that risk model. We have 4 separate pieces. We have to understand what we're doing, the change in those, the variation from past and present, comparative analytics, which is why Verizon's saying here the stuff is free, right? And move forward, right? So a couple of interesting things happen if you take this approach, I believe. First off, capability measurements kind of destroys governance, right? We don't really care. We can see what effective patterns, what effective processes and procedures are by doing correlations against established patterns. Compliance really simply becomes a factor of the impact of the impact landscape, unless you're really concerned about how a specific compliance program can help you defend and its effectiveness in defense in your comparison against other folks. So the assertion here is that the post-GRC world will be ushered in by a couple of factors. First, data. Data applied by technology, like a data warehouse, things that actually spawn operational instances that help defend the enterprise. Very pragmatic. Second, reporting becomes something that we do by measuring a lot of things and using multiple models, not just one GRC suite that runs us through a discovery exercise over and over and over and over again. Third, data sharing and comparative analytics are critical. Why? If you take that baseball card example, if you just give me the stats on any one of those players, I don't know if he's good, if he's bad, or what have you, until I can compare him against a significant sample of his peers. And then I can say, well, this guy's better than this guy, he's better than these 5 guys, he's the 7th best guy out of these 10, and so forth. And that's what we believe the future of GRC is. It's basically deconstructed, destroyed, and made operationally significant through these models. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So the Verus, this isn't a trick and this wasn't planned in advance, I just, as he was talking, I thought about it. So the Verus framework, I get that it's pretty freaking cool. You could profile an organization based on some identifiers about it, and sort of determine its expected performance based on comparing it to a peer group, right? But how then...
I'm not sure I get that far, but...
Okay, well, go back to the... Can we go back to the slides? So it looked like you're essentially collecting attributes on different organizations and their performance based on incidents they'd experienced, which is essentially how you would have controls for different types of risk manifestations. And you can then sort of determine, a different company that you don't have data on yet, but that has certain attributes. You might expect it to perform, how it might perform relative to a peer group, which you've then, shown what the performance of the peer group is. That's useful for you as the new organization. You say, okay, compared to other organizations in my fighting weight, I can expect this kind of knockout, and I can expect to last this many rounds in the fight. So that's great, and that helps you maybe quantify your exposure, but then how does that, do you have information in there that would help an organization figure out where they need to focus in order to improve their defenses? Do you have the sort of proactive information as well as the incident information?
Well, because each of these represents a failure, okay, they actually, I would think, would be real, right? So, in fact, in terms of actual performance metrics, anybody in an organization that does penetration testing or gets their systems tested regularly? Handful of folks? Okay. I'll ask. What's the benefit for you of a penetration test?
Scary management?
Well, I mean, really, you get a report back. What does that mean to you? Go ahead. It's a use psychometer. I used to work with a pen test team, and we used to express things in sort of, well, there's only so much we can do in a month, right? And we usually scope out by a month. Do you want us to go wide or deep? And how do you balance that depth versus width? And if it takes me a couple weeks to break in, right, and actually get to my goal, right, I've only proven one entryway into your organization, right? So here's what I've always thought of, and getting back to answering your question, one of the things, and I don't have steps here, but one of the things that I would assert is, if you did and this is one of the things I hope to do with Verizon, is if you perform a penetration test, right, I can model that. I can take the Verus object model, the attack model, and I can say, well, first the pen team did this, then they did that, then they did this, then they did, and they got a goal. Now I've got 900 cases. Hopefully that's going to grow exponentially over the next couple of years, that I can say, oh, you know what? Your pen test was exactly like these 15 incidents. Those 15 incidents cost this much money. Now you have a much more informative pen test versus, okay, go patch these things and hope that the vendor doesn't get screwed next month and have another vulnerability and we're just going to patch it over again. Honestly, I'll tell you what, after 5 years of working with a pen test team, it really became find the blank SA password. and this was, 2000 to 2005, things are a little different, but it really was just this fairly repetitive exercise. And what I really think is that we should do lightweight, very focused pen tests based on the patterns that we're most concerned of, the patterns that show up the most, the patterns that directly relate to specific impacts that we're concerned again. And then, when you think about prevent, detect, and respond, right, and our ability to do that, I think in terms of feeding operational metrics back into what we can expect in terms of performance into a business intelligence platform, we can take a look at the metrics that we describe out of discovery and mitigation if we truly do red team. I'm now not a believer at all in blue team exercises, by the way, for this reason. But I can get performance metrics. I can see if I'm hitting the home runs. I can see if my batting average is good, especially if now I've got 1,000 other penetration test results from different organizations, maybe similar, maybe not so similar, and I can benchmark myself against that. So that's a long way to answer your question, but I really do believe that and I'm not Verus, right? You guys can build models yourself. It's really, something that is kind of enjoyable once you get into it. But you can certainly do this. You just have to understand that comparative analytics is key. And to some extent, the ISACs are trying to do this, right? Anybody familiar with the ISACs? Yes? No? They're just groups of security folks who get together and talk at a high level. But the ISACs are trying to do this, and there are plenty of groups that are trying to do that. So anyway, did I answer your question in that rambling? Sorry.
Yeah, no, you did. It basically, you would take the results and then you can sort of tailor your defense plan to what didn't work for others. Or, you can emphasize the threats that manifested for other organizations similar to yours. It helps you prioritize your plans.
Sure, and we might say that we know that the numbering breaks down here, but we might say 1, 2, and 3 we know that we're concerned about, right? We're susceptible to. Maybe that's what came out in the penetration test or what have you. Or maybe that's what we're seeing now as a result of sucking in all of this information into a data warehouse, right? Well, if we know that we can see that pattern 1, 2, and 3, and then we have a 4th event that typically happens, well, now we should go say, now we can have, if you remember me saying so, some analysts jump up out of the cube and run down to the SOC going, watch out, right? Out of 10,000 different instances, I ran 100,000 simulations in 0.2 of a second, and by golly, 40% of the time we saw number 4 come up, and we've got a number 4, and that means bad. Yes, sir. Yeah, and really what you're talking about is kind of data obsolescence. And there's certainly plenty of, social sciences has plenty to teach us in that regard about how you might apply that. It's not perfect. Again, all of these models are just hypotheses, and they always are constantly getting falsified. Ours should be as well. Go ahead. Yeah,
so models regularly degrade. That's absolutely true. It's part of why it's important to continue to have feedback loops to keep you understanding what your performance is, and then you go back and you retrain your models based on fresher data. It doesn't stop. It's kind of like virus software. You have to keep updating it because new signatures come out. You need new signature files or whatever heuristics your virus scanning engine is using. Yep. You can retire old data. You can retire old cases, or you can actually factor that into the equations that come out of the modeling exercise. If you've actually got like a real statistical model, you can actually decay the variables associated with older data. so that it has less weight associated with that. That's a pretty common technique to have sort of decay variables. And then it just decays out of your sample set. Absolutely. That's why modeling is an iterative exercise, so that you can always figure out, these variables are decaying faster than those variables, so they need to be retired out faster.
Well, and complex, it can be complex. It may be simpler. We just don't know yet than we think. I was trying to get it up on the screen, but in this year's data breach report on page 21, we're showing it shows basically the various threat actions, and they're at a high level. They're malware, they're hacking, there's social, there's misuse, there's physical, there's error and environmental. And it shows their changes over time. And one of the cool things over the last 2 years is we've seen this huge spike in malware, just ginormous. And so what you have to do is you have to see that trend and make a decision. We've got something happening over time. Does this mean that 2005 models of attacks are informative or not? Maybe they still are. The other thing that's interesting is I've been in security since 94, 95, and back then a firewall was thought to be it. In fact, that was my first job out of college, was to educate customers as why they needed to get rid of just the packet filter on their routers and buy these $50,000 gauntlets. Right? I worked for an ISP, and at that point, that was the gauntlet firewall was the creme de la creme of how you defended your network. But what happens is over time, and you'll see this actually in the data from the data breach report, not to keep bringing it up, but it supports this, is that we tend to create Maginot lines. The obvious idea with firewalls is, port 80, port 443. Now, your firewall is neat that it blocks all these other things if it's configured properly and if it doesn't have vulnerabilities popping up. But really, you've just kind of, these attacks have gone from, and if you think about it in a normal distribution, these attacks have gone from being the most sophisticated attacks available to being just noise, basically, in your logs. Right? The same thing for AV. Right? We don't really worry about code red that much anymore. Why? Because it had this lifespan from being a very sophisticated piece to being something that AV generally picks up and helps us detect and respond to very quickly. So,
one other comment on that, actually, is that there's also a problem with the reverse. You can have data that is too new. It hasn't aged appropriate. There's sort of a seasoning process, if you will, that you can see sort of outlier data if the data is too new as well. So there's kind of a timing thing there. That's why it's important to sort of weight your sample sets appropriately. Question?
Let's get, she was first, sorry. Yes, ma'am. No. Okay, so right. So that's why we released the framework, right? Because we had that same problem, right? We don't have any data, but we want data out of it. We want to do quant analysis. We want to do these things, right? So the first thing was, well, how do we go get it, right? And that's what's cool about this year's data breach report is yeah, there's lots of great stats. I hope you read it. I hope you love those things. But to me, as kind of a dork, one of the coolest things is we actually went to a separate organization. We gave them a framework for which they could collect metrics from, basic analog experience, right? And they actually did it. With a little bit of training, they had to figure it out, but they actually did it. So what I would offer is what you're talking frustration, and I feel it, and you're talking frustration on two things. One, the models aren't helping you get quant data, right? Why? Because it's, well, what's likelihood? I don't know, 10%? Does that sound good to everybody in the room? Yeah, it's 10%, great. You have nothing, there's no structure to get you at that. There's a basic theorem, and that says if there's a model, right, and you and I both are given the model, the way to execute an outcome of the model in the same data, you should be able to go in that room, I should be in this room, we should have tones of silence, and we should come out with relatively similar results. Maybe our Monte Carlo simulations will be slightly different or whatever, but we should have relatively similar results. There are very few, let me back off of that because I know a couple of people with good models, but there are very few risk management programs that are that sophisticated yet, and very, very, very few models that you can do that with. Very few. So Veris was built. Now when I say it's freely available, verisframework.wiki.zoho.com. It's all right there. Yeah, it's linked all over the report. In fact, we have little call-outs and we talk about the data collection strategies and so forth. So you have a model problem. You also have, the models also give you context, right? So one of the reasons why we don't know where to go because the models are ridiculous as well. So there are several problems, and it just takes kind of a rational, critical thinking moving forward. Yes, sir.
I was going to ask, you don't have a list of successes.
Right.
You don't have a list of what works. But how do you know, percentage-wise, are you saying that because this attack happened over here and nowhere else, I can use the other?
No, sir. No, sir. And that is one of the most wonderful problems I think we have. I think as an industry, we really have one big problem, and that is quantifying the effectiveness, efficacy, people use different words, but of a control, right? Because it's no longer 100%. You have a complex system of controls, which is why I think PCI is a model. You have a complex system of controls because you have Maginot lines. In this year's data breach report, out of people who were had PCI concerns, 90% of them were compliant with end-to-end encryption, or encryption of data in transit, which is, you hear this end-to-end encryption is going to solve it all. No, it's another Maginot line. It's just like port 80, it's just like your AV. They will adapt. It's a complex, adaptive system. Anyway, back to what you were saying. That's why I'm very interested in like Gene Kim's work of visible ops for security. I'm talking about effectiveness. It's got to be evidence-based. It's got to be studied. That's one of what my risk team and my intelligence team is what we're working on as well and trying to figure that out. The other thing that's interesting is you think about the ability to prevent, detect, and respond. And one of the things that I'll assert is that there is, for an intelligent attacker, for somebody you have to actually worry about, there is no first level prevent. And you have prevent, detect, and respond, and the first level detect and respond only gets you to a second level prevent if you're good enough, right? And event modeling can show you that. But the point being, detect and respond we can get success metrics. That's why I love penetration testing now after hating it for so long. That's why I believe in red team testing. That's why I want to understand if we can put models together in a business warehouse and track effectiveness of spawned processes, automated spawned processes, and so forth. Excuse me. I get passionate.
It's cool. It's cool. Settle down. So it can be done. It probably will be done. I mean, this is, I think, the Veris framework's come a long way, Alex, but it's still in early stages.
Oh, it's still very, very, very early.
We're still in the problem of, if you're trying to do pattern detection, you have to, at least in retrospect, after some amount of time, know if you made a right versus wrong decision, right? So after some time, more sophistication in data, more data, I think that it will become clearer what the success stories are. So in transaction modeling, in fraud, for example, we have to know at the end of the day whether we made right or wrong decisions, because it costs us money either way. So since we're trying to optimize those decisions based on, a couple of factors, but those factors become money for us very quickly, we want to be very precise, right? If we were highly, highly risk averse, and there was no cost to, say, declining good transactions to us, then we would optimize our models in order to minimize loss as low as possible, right? But obviously, when you cut off a good transaction, that costs you a lot as well. So finding that balance point then becomes the challenge. But right now, I think we're still in kind of not out of the woods yet as far as what are the patterns that we're trying to isolate. And so as we get better at that, then we'll get better at, there's the patterns we're trying to isolate, and they're differentiated from the rest of operations, which, if they're not the patterns we're trying to isolate, is probably the good stuff, if that makes sense. Great.
Which is why I was stoked about the one guy with the data warehouse.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Preventing Zeus.
How many terabytes of data?
Lots.
Hadoop clusters.
Yeah, but that's why I'm
me
stoked
happy.
about that, because Zeus infections that are ACH transfers, that'll ruin a business. That'll end careers, that'll ruin lives. And he's stopping it because he's doing pattern matching. He understands what's going on, and he's got a very good success rate. So anyway, yes, sir. Sure, and I've got actually several years of experience in training that. I will tell you that for financial institutions, security departments, I've seen it be very easy. Depending on the bureaucracy involved and how big the security department is, and if everybody's playing ball and the CISO really says this is how life is going to be or else, it can be really easy. We've done 2-day trainings for sophisticated risk models and had success. We've done, kind of a couple morning trainings on the Verus framework. We're developing software for training that's going to make it even easier for folks. So it can be done fairly easily. Just depends on kind of the width of the security department and the breadth of the training that you're given. Yeah, I do, and I don't have any answers for you other than the fact that if there are already people I know that there are people who are committed to sharing data. And one of the things that I hope to do is to be able to evangelize, I use the word, sorry everybody, but I hope to be able to show people, well look, this is really informative. I'm glad you spent all this money, but look how much better it gets with comparative analytics, right? And guess what? Yeah, there's a data set that you can get for free. Verizon's always going to give you something free. But if you want real-time operational stuff, right, you're going to have to share back. And that's just the way it's going to be. It is going to be a meritocracy. And that's how I hope to approach it. Will it work? I have no idea. I'm optimistic, and so far, senior management at Verizon is, full steam ahead.
Doesn't work, we'll try something else.
That's true. Is that it?
Going once, going twice. Just kidding.
I'm at Alex Hutton on Twitter. If you want to send me something, you can just do the, hey, at Alex Hutton had a question about your stuff, and I'll get right back to you. It's pretty easy. If you do it if you do it tonight or immediately after, I can't verify the usefulness of my answer because pretty spent at this point. And I have a rendezvous, I think, with like the Seahorse or the Galleria bar.
And I'm at Selena Kyle, not to make it confusing, since that's not my name. Thank you guys for coming out. Appreciate it.